Hello, fellow teachers. This is Ben Wilcox, and I'd like to welcome you to this supplemental teaching activities video for Doctrine and Covenants sections 125 to 128. Remember that the purpose of these videos isn't to focus on commentary or insight, but to give you ideas, activities, and questions that you might consider using if you're teaching a Come Follow Me lesson this week. Also, the idea isn't to use every slide, every question, or every activity. Just pick and choose the ones that you feel are best suited to the needs of your students and the time frame that you have. All right, let's get started. Now, what I'd like to do with you this week is to give you two complete lesson plans on what I feel contain the real meat of this week's Come Follow Me sections. A lesson from section 127 and the main one from section 128. And then my third lesson idea is going to be more brief, a bit more supplemental, and is going to cover the final portion of section 128 that I like to call the Psalm of the Restoration. But first, lesson number 1, deep water. Our truth here. Facing life's trials with Joseph's attitude enables us to rise above adversity and find happiness despite hardship. And I really love this section and this principle. Here we get a chance to teach a truly transformational truth. Now, we don't have the power to change our students' circumstances or the difficulties that they might face, but we do have the power to alter the way that they see those difficulties, the way that they perceive them. Meaning, if we teach this well, we can significantly improve the quality of our students' lives. Well, not us necessarily, but the scriptures can. Joseph can. The truths that he teaches can. Perspective is everything, and Joseph illustrates this powerful perspective masterfully. Paul had this perspective. Joseph of Egypt had this perspective. Jesus had this perspective. And helping my students gain some of that same perspective, even on a small scale, fills me with a fire in the bones. So for an object, I do like to do an object lesson, and this one is particularly effective. And what you're going to need is a jar or a see-through container of some sort. You're also going to need enough dry popcorn kernels or dry beans to fill that container at least 3/4 full. And then you're going to need a ping pong ball. And then for the icebreaker, you place the ping pong ball into the jar, screw on the lid, and ask, have you ever felt like life did this to you? And then, in one swift motion, you turn the jar upside down and thump it down on the table. And everybody is going to nod in agreement. We've all had those kinds of experiences. Those times when we feel like everything has come crashing down around us, when the weight of the world lands on our shoulders. What can we do about that? What can we do when we feel buried by life's problems, its challenges, its misfortunes? You can promise your students that section 127 is going to help us out. And then I just leave that jar on the table upside down and tell them that we're going to come back to it later in the lesson. And then we do a quick brainstorming activity. You say, let's make a list of as many different trials that we can think of that Joseph Smith endured in his short 38 years of life. If you have a whiteboard or a chalkboard, you can just start listing them as they share. And here's a possible list of things that your students might mention. And if you wanted to add some others as a teacher, when they've given as many as they can, you could do that as well. But then I like to make this point. As we look at that list, that you could imagine that somebody who experienced that much opposition in their life would very likely become bitter, skeptical, deeply discouraged, or maybe give up on God, give up on their faith. But section 127 shows us that that's not the attitude that Joseph developed through those trials. The attitude that he did develop, that's what we want to examine. So, for the search activity, invite your students to read verses 2 through 4 and pick out the phrase that impresses them most, and to ponder what it teaches them about facing adversity in mortality. And then you can just spend the bulk of your class time allowing your students to share their phrases and discussing what they learned. And there's so much to digest here, so many great ideas. They'll find them. They're not too hard to discover. But once they've finished, you could summarize those principles with the following slide. Because here's how I would express Joseph's attitude. Turn mountains into molehills. Get accustomed to adversity. Seek strength in Scripture stars. Delight in difficulty. Depend on God's deliverance. Gladness, not grumbling. Find peace in persecution and triumph with toil. And the inside video can explain the origin of each of those phrases and help prepare you for a deeper discussion of those principles. It also features a few relevant quotes that add depth and understanding to those principles. A great video that you could show in conjunction with this lesson is the following one entitled, Come What May and Love It. It comes from a talk that was given by Elder Joseph B. Wirthlin and was one of my favorite talks he ever gave. And it illustrates the exact attitude that Joseph Smith is exemplifying in section 127. Come what may and love it. And a suggested search question that you might ask would be, what 4 specific things does Elder Wirthlin suggest we do when life gets hard? And then you're going to want to take the opportunity to really allow your students to try and apply the lesson personally. So I like to do a take it to heart application activity. You can give them the following handout and invite them to think of a specific trial that they're currently facing in their lives. Then invite them to select one of Joseph's attitudes that they feel could help them most in their particular situation, how they could apply it. And once they've done that, if they feel comfortable enough, you could even ask for some volunteers to share what they wrote. Then, to conclude the lesson powerfully, share the following quote from Joseph Smith and return to the object lesson. Joseph said, "If I were sunk in the lowest pit of Nova Scotia, with the Rocky Mountains piled on me, I would hang on, exercise faith, and keep up good courage, and I would come out on top." Pick up the jar from the beginning and ask, so what did Joseph do every time that he was in this situation? In the pit, with everything burying him. And then you take the jar, you shake it up and down while saying that he hung on, he exercised faith, and he kept up good courage. You'll find that as you shake that jar, the ping pong ball almost magically rises through the popcorn kernels and emerges at the top. That's what Joseph did. He always came out on top. And I really love that little ping pong ball that I've got because it has a smiley face on it. And I say that he always came out on top and still had a smile on his face. Well, I want to have that lowest pit, Rocky Mountains on top kind of faith. That's an attitude towards adversity that can get us through almost anything. Our takeaway slide plays off of Joseph's statement that deep water was what he was accustomed to swimming in. So encourage your students to just keep swimming, like Joseph did. Remind them that it doesn't matter how deep the water gets, as long as we keep moving our arms and legs in faith. We can rise above it all. Lesson number 2, one of the most critical sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 128. Truth, we cannot be saved without seeking to save our ancestors through temple work. And this is another easy lesson to get a fire in the bones for. Joseph was so excited about this restored truth, and you can't help but feel his enthusiasm and his joy over this subject. And I agree with Joseph. Temple work is a glorious subject. Not only does it draw us to the house of the Lord, where we can reap all of the amazing promised blessings for doing so, but it connects us with our heritage. It welds us to our ancestors and fills us with the spirit of service as we seek to bring salvation to others. So help your students to feel the beauty of a gospel that remembers everybody. A Father in heaven who forgets no soul, no matter when or where they lived. For an object, a chain. And you could easily get a section of chain from your local hardware store if you don't have any that's just lying around your home. And that object is going to come in handy later in your lesson when you discuss verse 18. For an icebreaker, I just like to ask a simple question. What is the most glorious subject of the gospel, according to Joseph Smith? What subject do you think would receive that kind of description, hold that distinction? Tell them that you want them to try and guess what it is, and then we'll go into section 128 to see if they got it right. Typically, when I teach this lesson, I get a lot of different answers. The atonement comes up frequently, celestial marriage, repentance, forgiveness, all of which are very important and glorious subjects. But what's the most glorious? Take them to verse 17, where we discover that it is baptism for the dead. Or, more generally speaking, vicarious temple work for the dead. And you ask, why do you think Joseph would say that? What's so glorious about the work for the dead? Then inform them that section 127 is going to help us to better understand the answer to that question. Now, in the Inside video, I talked about all the legal jargon that we find in section 128. And I made the point that this suggests the seriousness and the importance of this work. But for time's sake, if I had to leave something out for this lesson, this might be something that I would consider trimming. Instead, I jump right to verse 15 and give them the study guide handout to work from. The study guide is going to allow them to dig deeply into verses 15 through 18 and sets you up to have a really great discussion regarding the truths that are taught here after they've finished. Check out the Insight video for ideas on how to do that and insights that you could share as you go through each particular question on the handout. But one thing that I always like to do as part of that discussion is I like to share the parable of the keys from my father. That little story really works wonders in helping us to understand the principle of neither can we without our dead be made perfect. Also, within that discussion, you're going to want to refer to the chain that you brought in as you talk about creating a welding link between ourselves and our ancestors, as we form this great family chain of salvation through the work that we do in the temple. We don't want to become a weak link in that chain. And one more thing that you might consider, if you have time, the final two verses of section 128 are really quite fascinating because in them we discover that at the second coming, the collective body of the church is going to offer a great offering to the Lord in his temple. This offering harkens back to the phrase that was uttered by John the Baptist back in section 13 at the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood. And that's where he promised that the sons of Levi would make some future offering of righteousness. These verses here in 128 reveal what that offering is, what it's going to be. And what is it? It's a book containing the records of our dead. This work of salvation that we do for our ancestors is absolutely critical to God's divine work and glory of bringing to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. A great video to accompany this discussion, if time permits, would be to show the promised blessings of temple and family history work. And here it features numerous quotes from the brethren detailing the great promises for doing vicarious work for the dead. Encourage your students to take note of all of those blessings that flow from this most glorious of all subjects. And for a quote, I like the following from Elder Quentin L. Cook. encourages us to focus our efforts to do temple work on our own ancestors. He said, "The doctrine of the family in relation to family history and temple work is clear. The Lord, in initial revelatory instructions, referred to baptism for your dead. Our doctrinal obligation is to our own ancestors. This is because the celestial organization of heaven is based on families." Take it to heart question. Have you ever had a glorious experience with family history or temple work? And then I will go and do. What's one small way you could participate in this glorious work this week? Then I like to give them some suggestions. Log into Family Search and explore your family tree. See if you can find one new name or story. Ask a parent or grandparent to share a memory or story about one of your ancestors. Then record or write it down. Index names for a few minutes using the Family Search Indexing app, a simple way to help others find their ancestors. Prepare a family name for temple baptism. Visit a temple grounds nearby and spend a few minutes reflecting on what the most glorious subject means to you. And then finally, go to the temple and do work for the dead. The takeaway slide reminds us that temple and family history work is the most glorious work that we can get involved in. Remind them that this work brings heaven and earth together. It connects us to our ancestors, and it connects us to Christ, the one who made the connection possible. Promise them that if they participate in this work, even in small and simple ways, they're going to feel something stir inside them. Their hearts will turn. They'll feel the spirit of Elijah swell within them, and they'll weld themselves to the great chain of their heritage, bring salvation to others and themselves. Now, a quick final principle and a teaching idea that you may want to share if you have the opportunity. And it comes from the closing portion of section 128. I call it the Psalm of the Restoration. And we find it in verses 19 through 23. Truth, when we truly understand the restoration and all it has brought, our hearts can't help but rejoice. And for an icebreaker, you could play a quick game of Hangman. And I imagine I don't have to really explain how this works, but the phrase they're trying to discover is a voice of gladness. An alternate idea, if you're not into playing Hangman, you could just ask, how would you complete this sentence? Now, what do we hear in the gospel which we have received? A voice of blank. How do you think the prophet would fill in that blank? And have them make some guesses, and invite them to check their answer in section 128, verse 19. And if they said gladness, or mercy, or truth, then they got it right. But the major emphasis that I feel this section communicates is the idea of gladness. The gospel is a message of happiness and joy. And that seems to be what Joseph is most feeling at this time as he's revealing the glory of the vicarious work for the dead. He almost can't contain himself, and so he just bursts forth in this sudden outpouring of praise and rejoicing. Another idea that you might consider, sometimes I like to introduce this section by playing a portion of one of my favorite pieces of classical music, Bolero. And in that piece of music, a single instrument is heard playing the melody of the song. It's very quiet and soft. But as the music progresses, new instruments are added, little by little, until by the end of the piece, the full orchestra is playing. The volume is loud, powerful. And that's the sense I get from these verses. It begins with a single voice singing the glory of the restoration. And then more and more voices are added, until finally, even the mountains and the rivers and the trees can't hold back. So then, after, read these verses with your students and invite them to mark every time they see a word or phrase that suggests happiness or rejoicing. They're going to find a lot. And then in the great spirit of that song, I like to ask my students to share their answer to this question. What is a doctrine or belief or part of the church that brings you joy? That could launch you into a powerful, inspiring, and joyful discussion about all the things that bring us joy as members of the church. The takeaway slide repeats that stirring adage from the beginning of the song. And what do we hear in the gospel which we have received? A voice of gladness. Testify of your gladness and the joy that you feel personally as a disciple of Jesus Christ's restored church. Just let your students feel your enthusiasm for the gospel. It really is a magnificent thing to be involved in such a glorious and great work. And that's going to conclude this supplemental teaching activities video for this week. I really pray that it helps you. If you're planning on teaching this week, I hope it makes your lesson prep easier, quicker, more effective. And most importantly, I hope that it helps to fill you with a fire in the bones for teaching. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Now get out there and teach with power.